Hello again. Today we're delving rather deep into a world of secrets and dark mystery. Stand aside, the Illuminati, you American Vision, and the Order of the Garter. Give it up for the Gemini Lazarus Syndicate. Now this order is made up of 5 members: Aero or Euro the Grace, Blake Placid, Dhorica Trapstile, Red Rose, and Mirror Haidist. And the one who brought them all together? Well, all I'll say is that he only reveals himself to his victims when the end game is near. Not even his associates know who he really is. You see, this small group of powerful men and women had lost a great deal in their past lives, and would do just about anything to reverse the tragedies that had befallen them. Each member of the Gemini Lazarus Syndicate possesses immortality as well as their own respective powers. Dhorica Trapstile uses a Ra's eye symbol to obtain the desires of her victims, while Blake Placid, the crocodile man, uses his animal ferocity to beat his opponents. And Aero possesses an ancient artifact which allows him to enter anywhere he pleases. He can even cause event horizons to slide open in walls and locked doors. He can even traverse dimensions. Also there is Red Rose, who can control the thorny vines of her garden, and the Mirror Haidist, the faceless man with a mirror mask. He has a head full of trapped souls, ghosts of himself from all over the multiverse. Over time he has learned the trick of projecting these ghosts from his mirror visor, filling a battlefield with thousands of those he has salvaged behind his polished mask. And what about the secret master who organizes the small group of immortals? Who is he? Chances are you've met him already. Though I don't want to hit you with any spoilers right now. I want to wait for the right moment to reveal his identity. Meet Blake Placid, the template of all those fairy tales you heard as a child. You know the ones, stories such as Beauty and the Beast, and the one about the Frog Prince. Blake's one true love was the fair princess of King Cayman. She was the one who brought Blake his humanity and charm with nothing more than a kiss. Originally, Blake Placid was a beast and a reptilian, until his love offered him a kiss, a brief peck on the cheek that turned him into a prince, a handsome young devil who lived out his days in happiness and contentment. That was until his fair and loving mate was murdered in cold blood by a jealous witch of the Marais. Blake Placid reverted back to his crocodile form. Since then, he has dedicated much of his time trying to cheat death into giving back his beloved. Dhorica Trapstile was an Egyptian princess who, during the dynasty of Dark Mists, she was to be the pristine queen over all of Egypt. Though she was not interested in that destiny. She fell in love with a mortal man, which angered the priesthood, and she and her lover were laid down on a slab. Her lover was murdered and she was cursed, forced to exist for an eternity as an outcast, a ghoul of living death. The Gemini Lazarus Syndicate is merely a secret order among many. The Grange and the Rosicrucians, as well as the Bilderberg Group, Freemasons, Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the Benevolent Order of Elks, the Knights of Pythias, Order of Owls, are but a few names to throw out there. There is one secret order I've covered already, and that is the Mythkey Institute. Yes, that institute that claims to have humanity's best interests at heart. They certainly claim to be more principled than the Gemini Lazarus Syndicate overall. But not all that goes on in secrecy is built on evil and tainted lies. Most, if not all, the members of the Syndicate are merely lost souls. That being said, however, they have never lost sight of their goal. Now take Aero or Euro for example. He originally came from Byzantium. He is in fact a mythological being known as a Grace. The Graces were men and women who could bestow beauty upon any mortal with just a touch. Now, since he joined the Gemini Lazarus Syndicate sometime in the late 1940s, Aero took the mantle of the Oryx. This mantle of the Oryx is a symbol no less, a sacred headdress worn by those of high-ranking status within the Syndicate. What you will hear now is a recording of Euro's story, explaining who he is and where he came from.
Euro was a grace, and like all graces, he had a special ability. He had the power to make mortals beautiful with a mere touch of his hand. Even the most unattractive of humans could attain the pleasing looks they had always yearned for under his touch. He was a mythic creature, a legendary individual. He had traversed the Greek Isles, had traveled to the summit of Mount Olympus, and received a gift from Hephaestus, the keeper of the forge. He had watched the master pull the steel from the fire and send it thrusting into the well of celestial waters, sending plumes of steam billowing outwards. I have seen both gods and brave titans. I watched Hephaestus as he raised his mighty hammer above the anvil for no other reason than to shape the very tool I needed in my quest. This tool was to become my skeleton key, able to gain entry anywhere, anytime I so wished. I asked the god of the forge to create for me a knocker that was imbued with magical powers. If I knocked 3 times, I could enter any house, any building, or even enter another dimension, if I so required. But not just any door knocker. This one I could simply carry around with me in my pocket. When I needed to enter a place that was out of bounds, or if I wanted to get to the other side of the world in the same time it takes most people to step into the next room, I would place the knocker against a wall. Knock 3 times, and I'd be there.
Okay, well in this segment we're going to focus on Aero, or Euro, as he often went by several different aliases during his travels and wanderings. Euro ended up in a hotel in Warsaw, Poland, right before the Blitz. It was at a bar where he noticed Vladislav for the first time, and he was captivated by this unique individual.
Euro was sitting by one of the windows in an alcove, nursing a pint of beer, waiting for the table waiter to come and serve his meal. He felt enchanted as the lad stepped down from the bar and began to walk over to him. He was full of confidence, this one.
"You're new here,"
he said as he approached.
"I haven't seen you here before."
"I'm here on business," the Grace told him. "I don't suppose you know if there's any decent lodgings nearby."
"Well, all our rooms are booked at the moment,"
he said regretfully.
"But there's a lodge about a mile up the road. It's called the Plow. You can't miss it."
"Am I to conclude that this place belongs to you or a family member, perhaps?" Euro asked.
"My uncle owns it,"
he said.
"My mother just looks after the bar and kitchen."
The boy then told him his name was Vladislav. They continued to talk. Euro listened as this delightful little character told him much about himself, about what he did, his interests. He identified himself as a queer. In spite of the present attitudes towards gay people, he seemed refreshingly open about it. In fact, Euro was amazed that this exceptionally bright boy had an uncanny knack for predicting future events. He even told the Grace that, in the future, people like him would one day be able to be open and not have to fear ignorance. Queer people will celebrate with street parties and hang bright flags from the window with pride. As it happened, Vladislav dabbled in oil painting and sometimes charcoal and pastel sketching. He loved to paint butterflies. He enjoyed capturing their many colors and patterns. Euro asked if he could look at some of his artwork. Vladislav was thrilled.
"Of course,"
he said. His features were beginning to brighten. Euro downed the rest of his beer in one. He wiped his lips gently with the napkin and, rising to his feet, began to follow young Vladislav through a door that came out onto an open courtyard. He led the Grace around the outside of the building until they reached what looked like a small glass conservatory. There, among various plants and flowers, were his canvases. Each of them was fresh and had been propped up to dry. It was such a contrast here. In the glass environment that his uncle had allowed to go to ruin, judging by the lack of carpeting, lack of care, and the overall shortage of attention, time and neglect had already broken apart laid slabs, every crack and fissure burgeoned with small weeds, and the pervading dampness and darkness had brought about growths, formations of fungi that had risen like curling umbrellas amidst this young artist's treasures. Butterflies! Many beautifully colored butterflies. Perhaps there were over a dozen of them. So ethereal and fragile they looked, the colors full of moist tones, almost as though someone had placed a thin silken veil before them. So many varieties of butterfly! How unfortunate that they had been placed here amidst the ruin and the decay of idleness. These works of art outshone idleness. Yes, they verily surpassed the place in which they lay, surpassed the table and chairs with their awful peeling paint, surpassed the broken slabs with their weeds shooting through every crack. It was deeply disturbing. These fine works of art belonged in a gallery. Vladislav himself belonged somewhere perhaps more congenial, as Euro was about to realize.
Probably won't win any prizes, the young man said rather modestly, but I enjoy painting them. They're my babies.
Well, you definitely do have a fertile imagination, Euro stated, nodding his head in approval.
Would you like one?
Asked Vladislav, clasping his hands behind his back. He was like an exuberant child in his motions, and the Grace did not quite know what to say, except for, "Really? May I have one? How much are they?"
"No, you can have one,"
he smiled. Euro was honored and speechless. He stood back. His eyes began to scan each canvas in turn to see which one he liked most of all. There were so many. Seeing that he was having so much difficulty choosing, Vladislav went to one painting in particular, a beautiful red admiral. He picked it up.
"This one's my favorite," he asserted, "but I would like you to have it."
Euro looked at it favorably and smiled. "It's wonderful." There was only a short, reverent pause as they stood, admiring this stunning painting, but that moment abruptly came to a halt as there came a sharp interruption, forcing the Grace to turn suddenly.
"Oh, I didn't know you had guests."
A small, dumpy-looking woman continued, leaning against the doorway. How long she had actually been standing there eavesdropping, neither Vladislav or Euro could say. 2:30 in the afternoon, and she was still in her negligee and slippers, with a lit cigarette in her hand. Her hair was long and quite lank, and raven black with very little body to it. She was about 5'7", with the overall appearance and lineage that may have dated back to the old Salem witches. Vladislav, with a rather insecure look, said,
"Mother, I didn't see you there."
He looked up at Euro.
"This is my friend, Euro. Euro, meet my mother, Lepska."
"Lepska, pleasure to meet you." She merely stood her icy ground, her right elbow resting upon her left arm, which, in turn, was relaxed to cover her midriff. Her cigarette was still clumped between her index and middle finger. Vladislav is very talented. I can see him becoming quite an artist. Her face tilted haughtily as she exhaled some smoke through shallow, diminutive teeth.
"I don't know really much about art,"
she articulated.
"All I know is that my son wastes nearly all his time with these silly fads of his."
She took another sharp drag from her cigarette. Euro's own features had begun to harden at this point.
"I take it you are his latest?"
She probed with a sharp stab of her nicotine-stained fingers at the air. I'm sorry?
Well, I suppose you two are an item.
Mother!
The boy shot. Of course, the harridan continued.
I think it's so selfish.
She intoned, addressing young Vladislav.
I mean, you have absolutely no idea what you put me through, do you?
Stop it, Mother!
Shot little Vladislav contemptuously.
I know what you are, and I know what it is you do.
This vulgar creature persisted.
You go around like some little trollop, bringing your strange friends back here. You don't even think about me, the embarrassment I feel. You have people saying all sorts. They see you the way you go about. I know what they say. That boy is strange. He has no morals.
Now hold on. You're carrying this a little too far.
My son,
she said.
He has no thought for my feelings, no thought at all. He's selfish.
Mother, please.
Everybody suspects. Everybody here around talks.
She persisted.
I am at my wit's end with him.
Euro tried then to ease her misgivings and speak with an air of diplomacy that was about as tolerant as he was likely to get at this point. Listen, I don't wish to cause any problems, really. But I think Vladislav is old enough to make up his own mind about what he wants to do. He has his own path to walk.
Path?
She stabbed the air with the end of her cigarette.
What path? What are you talking about? Who are you anyway?
Mother, I told you,
Vladislav said with embarrassment.
This is Euro. He's just a friend.
Oh yes, I know,
she ranted.
And you have so few of them, you tell me this all the time.
All right, I know that I've probably stirred up a lot of problems by being here, so I'll take my leave.
No, you don't have to,
little Vladislav objected. So nice meeting you, Vladislav, Euro said. Thank you very much for the painting, and I wish you all the best. His mother stood and watched the grace leave, arms folded and looking for all the world as if she was sucking on a rather poisonous insect. It was a wonder Vladislav could bring any friends back at all, what with that distrustful harridan knocking about the place, sticking her oar in everywhere.
Euro discovers a young artist in Poland, a young man called Ladisla. He also meets Ladislav's mother, who is not the most gracious and understanding of human beings. Far from it. She's rude, ignorant, and abrasive to her son. Euro hatches a plan to try and save the young artist from a cruel and remedial life in Poland. He also has an idea that will change the mother's mind, and hopefully she will see her way clear to allowing her son the chance to flourish without further hindrance.
The walk helped me collect my thoughts and to prepare for the task that lay ahead. I knew that Vladislav, his mother, and uncle would be asleep at this hour. I also realized the doors to the inn would be locked. The windows would be bolted shut from the inside. This wasn't a problem, however. Reaching into my coat pocket, I removed a small metallic object. This strange item in my hand was the Hephaestus door knocker, with its lion's maw molded around a brass ringlet, a typical design for a door knocker, one might say. All it took then was a single step forward, and I was inside the building. The inn with its windows locked securely, and its doors latched. No ordinary burglar or intruder would have been able to enter. I quickly found myself staring into near darkness, with only my senses to steer me through the interior of this building. I moved unhurriedly and cautiously, feeling my way along the walls. Uncertain of the layout, I passed blindly from room to room, through locked doors and solid partitions. I simply followed the impetus. It led me through rooms, and finally, to a darkened staircase. Upon the first landing, as far as I could tell, there were 3 residential rooms, The other rooms were for guests. With the knocker in my grasp, I simply placed it flat against the wall and knocked gently 3 times. Another portal opened. Again, I walked through the partition as though it was air. When I was in the next room, the solid wall reappeared behind me as though nothing had touched it or passed through it. My eyes surveyed the room. I vaguely saw a bed with a man laying asleep in the faint moonlight that filtered in through the open window. The man laying there hardly stirred. I moved to the next room. To my relief, I saw Vladislav fast asleep in his bed. Soon, you will be free of judgment. Be patient. Leaving him, I knocked again, and very carefully so as not to wake the whole household. Eventually, I found her, the mother, Lepska. She was sound asleep, truly dead to everything, as she invariably was even during her waking hours. I would work my magic. I stood over her, and slowly I began to minister the renovation gift. I touched her face while she slept, working the ancient alchemy of the creature Grace, converting her in both mind and appearance. Any imperfection, any flaw, any defect in her appearance, any line or wrinkle would disappear suddenly. I would iron her out like a crease in a shirt. Her personality I would take and make of it a blushing orchid. The hymn I began to chant was in ancient Hebrew, and suddenly I felt the goose flesh of her left arm that was bare resting above the covers. This was the beginning, the steady road to her renovation. Suddenly, as I watched her form, lit by the pale moonlight that cast through the window, her breasts, even the bones beneath her flesh, began to mold themselves quickly to the shapes and sizes I had chosen for her. My hands were relaying these modifications to her physical appearance, like a magician working his magic, or perhaps like Jesus, who performed the resurrection of Lazarus. It was as though I was holding a pencil and eraser to her imperfections, wiping away all that was crudely cast and replacing her with a sketch more pleasing to the eye. From caterpillar to bright imago, that was what Lepska had in store as she laid there, changing, adjusting physically and mentally while she slept. Her transformation was almost complete. Oh, she looked 20 years younger and lovelier than she had ever looked.
Well, by this time, I think it's safe to say that Aero does exactly as his heart demands of him, and without any thought of the consequences. What can I say? He's a Grace, a relic from a time when pagan gods and goddesses did things out of desire or a capricious nature. First, he gains entry into a locked building while the whole household sleeps. Then he goes right ahead and uses his powers to renovate Lepska as she sleeps, offering her grace and beauty. Then, after she wakes up, she is confused, still imagining she is caught in some beautiful dream.
I know you,
she said, her eyebrows knit with an almost childlike questioning. It was strange and almost amusing to behold. Her common dialect and speech had altered considerably, along with her appearance. On a certain level, things did seem familiar to her. It was as though the Grace's practiced alchemy had left her somewhat in a daze. Euro's face, for example, evoked in her feelings that she could barely place. Soon, however, she would no longer want to recollect. This I divined with a margin of certainty. I had consigned her past to near oblivion, taking with it all logic and speculation as well. She was almost an entire clean slate. In response to her questioning, I merely answered, "Of course you know me. I am Yoro."
Yoro,
she repeated with that regular look of curiosity and wonder on her face.
I like that name.
She arched her shoulders and clapped her hands together joyously. It was all like an innocent little game to her now. It gave me so much delight to know finally that I had not lost the charm. The gift of the renovation was as sharp as it ever was. And I predicted this complete transformation would serve young Vladislav better. She would no longer be the mother that continued to scorn him, but a friend, capable of tolerance, and so much more. I felt elated suddenly, and, taking hold of her hand, I beckoned her to follow. I led her to the large mirror that was raised upon her dresser. I neither bid her nor forced her to look. Her curiosity was all the motivation she needed. She was a new person and quite eager and hungry for new and exquisite things. She was beautiful now, emblazoned or embossed in smiles and cheer, from within and from without. Now she was mostly carefree, and she danced. There was no music, but she could barely refuse to give vent to our passion. It was a wonder that her antics did not wake the entire household. Suddenly, she stopped her little dance, as though taken in by an unexpected revelation. Her right hand went up to cover her mouth. She let out a sharp breath as though she had seen an old friend. She took me in her arms as she wept such crocodile tears. "Oh, my word! Yoro, yes, I do remember you," she said. "Can you forgive this foolish woman?" The tears fell staccato from each spoken phrase. "Will Vladislav forgive me? I've been so terrible," she sobbed. "I don't know why he remains with me. I really don't. I only wanted to keep him safe. Yoro, you believe me? Tell me you believe." She looked up at me, her face wet with tears but could never again be stained. Abruptly, there came a knock at Lepska's door.
Mother, who is that in there with you? I heard voices.
It was Vladislav.
Mother, are you all right? Mother?
I was beginning to feel the weakening effects of my alchemic powers. I felt almost nauseous, exhausted. Lepska glanced at the door and then back at Yoro. It was true. I had not used my gift for so long, I had quite forgotten how utterly draining it was to apply the renovation to a mortal.
"That was Vladislav," she said to me, as I felt close to passing out. "I will let him in, and you can explain to both of us your plans for a new beginning."
The problem was, I was in no condition at that point to explain anything. I could hear the persistency of Vladislav outside the door, and the sounds he made began to fade and become something like dissonance. I passed out, finally. How long had I been unconscious? It was too soon to tell. While I rested, I had no idea what was happening in the rest of the house. Had the household become aware of Lepska? And, if so, how was Vladislav handling the reality of her transformation? Questions would arise in her presence. People would notice. Friends of Lepska would hardly recognize her at all at this point, though all might just wonder in her physical absence, what has befallen her? There was probably a police investigation for all I knew. Most likely there was great turmoil and confusion, and I would be at the heart of it. I had to leave, and quickly. But that was impossible. The thought of leaving Vladislav was abhorrent to me in light of what the violation I had just committed. I was responsible. Lepska was a fake because of me. She had become a strange and delightful affectation. When she spoke, it was as though her words were scripted. When people plied her with questions, they would receive no response, just happy laughter, and she would dance and swirl with delight. Lepska had waltzed the corridors alone in her elegant new gowns, like a drunken swan, lively, emancipated, twirling and twirling, never stopping. never pausing. And I had ruined everybody's life here. I had ruined Lepska's life as well. I was sure I heard a raised, imposing voice say,
"Get up!"
The voice spoke in German. I raised my head gingerly. I recognized the uniform of the man standing over me.
"I said, get up!"
shouted the raised voice. I realized quickly I was being threatened at gunpoint. Rising to my feet, I did exactly as I was told at first, but as the seconds became minutes, I realized I had to do something. Finally, and inevitably, we were moved to the camps. Vladislav's uncle was set free, but the rest of us? We were curiosities, malformations to be sectioned and categorized and probed. I had plucked Lepska from reality and had placed her in a perpetual dream. It was as though I had taken something human from her and had made her someone's marionette. She danced as they took her into the street that fateful morning. She danced when they took her from her home, and she was dancing as they took her life for showing such crazy, crackpot insolence. She lay in a muddy puddle as it rained in Warsaw. Silently, she lay, prostrate, face down. The puddles of dirt turned blood red around her. A bullet had ended her unnatural joy, stopping her in her tracks. A uniformed aggressor had fired his weapon once. In a shot, the puppet's strings had been irrevocably cut. How absurd and tragic this had seemed. The boy, Vladislav, beside himself finally, simply stared at this lifeless corpse. I don't think he understood. This had been his mother, the same woman who, only the day before, had displayed ignorance instead of understanding, and had always cast her son with suspicion. Now, she was just this faceless entity, without identity or status, a minus laying flat down in the mud. The boy kept staring at the corpse, tears flowing down his face. Did he know? Did he actually recognize something in her? These uniformed men shouted, goading him to move. They marched him with the rest of us, all of the ill-fated people they had managed to round up in the night. I could hear the machine gun fire as more of the captured were viciously cut down. There was a vast crowd of prisoners. They shuffled swiftly past these bodies, this swarm of faces, people, neighbors, and family, loved ones. Most of them dead. I shouted his name, hoping for an answer. All these strange faces. I did find the boy eventually. I made my way over to his side. I allowed them to imprison all of us. I also allowed the deaths of the few and all, because I was already numbed by the barbarity of it all, and also by my own actions too. 3 long years went by before we were finally freed. I had every single item of clothing and every possession confiscated, including my door knocker. Truth is, I could have still escaped, but I chose not to. I had learned that every action still had a consequence, even for angelic beings such as myself. For what is the point in history if we fail to learn from it? I learned, but think of how many had to die for my education. I think of young Vladislav. He would have been an old man today. Sometimes I sit in a bar in Poland, and I think to myself, if only he was here now, and could see all the changes that have come about since the Stonewall riots. To imagine that boy, that brave boy, dreamed of the day when all people, all genders, all denominations could live in peace, rather than with persecution. It fills my soul with a deep sadness.
Mirror Haidist was an alchemist of the priesthood during the long-reigning Toltec Empire. During the Golden Age, Central American civilizations were flanked by an area known as the Multiversal Desert. The sands there were rich with minerals capable of phase-shifting between dimensions. When the industrious Toltec alchemists discovered a way to transform this mineral into glass, they fashioned a mirror with properties capable of allowing its masters to see what could be, as well as what might have been. During the ceremony, the high priest fashioned a face shield from the mineral and applied the burnished glass to his face. The glass shield adhered itself, fusing with his flesh for all time. Then there followed an overwhelming onslaught. Other iterations of this man's personality had traversed the barrier from 1,000 other alternate realities, fusing themselves, bonding with the Mirror Haidist, allowing him not only to see 1,000 possibilities, but opening the window to his face to allow 1,000 other interlopers free rein into his thoughts and his mind. The Mirror Haidist literally became the vessel of 1,000 spirits. His body played host to the myriad mirrored versions of himself from across the multiverse. His own will and spirit was submerged instantly under a cacophony of voices, all raised in confusion, fear, and rage. After many seasons, and after much meditation and persistence, he learned to calm the voices within his head. He promised the others that one day he would learn the secret to separate them all, the spirits, the minds, and the souls all trapped within him, and give them all freedom and autonomy again. Centuries passed like a steady stream, a thread through the multiverse. Many of these threads branched out tangentially, as they quite often did, creating many possibilities and historical deviations. Mara Rosa was a florist to Catherine the Great, who treasured her knowledge of flowers. The palace blossomed with fragrance and colour, and Catherine had assigned special guards to protect the various specimens from the harsh winter climate. Mara Rosa grew vain, and trusting in the respect and admiration of her mistress, she commenced to expand her garden, taking the roses to the next step in their evolution. Her rose garden turned from a beautiful red crimson to a deathly black. By day they delighted Russian high society. By nightfall they had already begun to encroach upon the palace, climbing the grand marble walls and scaling the many pillars and rooftops. Mara, with her envious heart and hunger for her mistress's approval, overtook the palace, filling every nook and cranny with her black, thorny presence that seemed like death had crept up on the living and unsuspecting Tsarina and her house. Mara was dubbed Red Rose, the keeper of the night garden. Transcendental ruin was brought about as the Mirror Haidist stood and gloated over Mara's fine work. He appeared before Red Rose, clapping his hands admiringly. His master, the nameless, faceless man who even now answered to nobody, the shadowy entity who had brought all these wayward souls together and had brought about the Gemini Lazarus Syndicate, stood in the darkness and smiled. Mirror Haidist approached Red Rose, sat nestling in her throne of many thorns. "Pray, who approaches?" she asked. "I am the Mirror Haidist," came the response from the man with his face covered by a glass mask. "I have scaled the width and breadth of each mirror universe, looking for powerful minds who know death and eternal life, and can manipulate both with equal measure. you might see your way clear to joining our endeavor. Well, Red Rose was eager to show off her genius. First she sealed the Tsarina in a thorny eternal sleep within the palace, where Mara Rosa would continue to feed off her muse's love and respect. Well then, Mara, aka Red Rose, went with the Mirror Haidist and their faceless master to the mirrored reality, our reality, where the Gemini Lazarus Syndicate awaited them. Each of their skills, Red Rose, the Mirror Haidist, Aero the Grace, Placid, and Trapstile, would become valuable commodities to the faceless Dark Master, who persisted to issue orders and directions from the shadows. Okay, well, in a future video we'll take a glimpse into the machinations of these 5 elusive characters, as they will play a big part in the adventures to come.